Hello, everyone. This is Philosophy of the People with Ben Birch and Stefan Bertram. I'm entering the rare period of the year where it's daytime for both of us at the same time.
Yeah, it's exciting.
And today we're going to be talking about Ben Shapiro, which got everyone talking in chat before the episode even started.
Yeah. So a few weeks ago, I did this talk at the Pacific Division meeting of the American Philosophical Association on publicly engaged political philosophy from the left. And so, in the course of that, I was kind of talking about how the kind of various ways that if you want to make a background in philosophy useful for advancing lefty political purposes, various things that might look like. And of course, one of them was that you can sort of take that training and take it apart and putting back together arguments and use it in ways that are helpful to debunking these sort of mega popular charlatans who.
And obviously, Ben Shapiro is meant to be himself to be a debunker of the Libby left.
Yeah. No, for sure. Right. I mean, that is very much his branding. I mean, I say this old 2017 New York Times profile that where he's referred to at one point as the destroyer of weak arguments. So that's the image he's cultivated for himself. So yeah, I think that but my impression, the way things stand, when I look at it, is that there are these figures, of whom Shapiro is definitely one of them, though not the main one I was talking about in that talk, who have these massive audiences, and they sometimes talk about philosophical topics, and it's just absolute nonsense. And if you sort of apply the level of scrutiny that you would train people to apply in a critical thinking or intro to philosophy class to this, a lot of this just falls apart. And so I think it's a real dereliction of duty if people are too busy writing articles for one another to read to ever get around to pointing out what's wrong with this.
Sometimes a lot of the reasoning might be that it's just not that intellectually interesting to kind of debunk someone like Ben Shapiro. And I think it's worse than someone like I've forgotten his name, the Canadian man who takes drugs.
Jordan Peterson.
John Peterson. Because Jordan Peterson will say that, Kant is a dragon or whatever. While Ben Shapiro is just like, he's kind of bad.
Yeah. No, I think Peterson is definitely has a kind of craziness that's much more exciting. I mean, Shapiro is just kind of wrong in a way that is often not that interesting. But even with Peterson, people, I mean, you really do. I mean, there is a pretty amazing disconnect between the amount of popularity that guy, attained at his height. And I mean, I should say even now, I mean, I would be amazed if we opened up right this second, like Amazon's list of, top 100 most bought and read titles in the last week, and we didn't find
especially if we opened the philosophy section.
Yeah, especially if we open the philosophy section, my God, but maybe even the main one, right?
Yeah, imagine you asked an ordinary American who the top philosophers are right now. If you got any answer, quite likely you wouldn't get any answer at all, but if you did.
Yeah. No, if you did, probably a lot of people would mention him, right? So given that level of mega popularity, I mean, there's certainly, I think even now, I would be amazed if there was a Barnes and Noble anywhere in the English-speaking world that didn't have 12 Rules for Life in it. Likely.
Do you know who the top author on Amazon philosophy is right now?
Who?
Tony Blair.
Oh, awesome. What's the book?
Tony Blair on Leadership, Lessons for the 21st Century. I guess it just came out.
Sure. Wow. Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm just gonna nurture myself with the version of reality where that was the book that he wrote from his prison cell. But yeah, I mean,
the book on the list I'd recognize as philosophy comes in at 12.
So even there, right? I mean, like, again, there's just this massive gap between this sort of mega popularity of, again, Jordan Peterson was the primary example as used in the talk, and how little effort some of the people who are in the best position to do so have put into explaining what's wrong with the things that he says. Now, it could be even there. Of course, it's more exciting in a certain way than somebody like Ben Shapiro, who we're going to be talking about. But could be even there. You don't find it like intellectually stimulating. That's a matter of taste. But I think that there's a more basic issue here, which is that academia as a system tends to churn out intellectuals whose incentives are all to write things for each other, and to take far less interest in what goes on in the rest of the world, rather than I don't know. I mean, if you have um, society supporting people to do this, thinking that you might actually take an interest in the sort of discourse that all the plebs are having at the same time. So that was kind of the part of the larger point I was making in that talk. And in there, I kind of had a sentence where I was like, okay, so I'm talking about Jordan Peterson right now, but I could just as easily talk about, Ben Shapiro or Sam Harris or whoever, but, on to the main point. And, I published that, talk a couple weeks ago in the Substack. And then I was kind of thinking about it later in the week. I was like, you know what, though? I feel bad for skipping over Ben Shapiro so quickly. And especially because he wrote a book that's just very relevant to the interests of people who would read the Substack. Oh, I appreciate that. Yeah, I did sort of work at a warehouse. I worked in the receiving area of Meyer for a while, but so lots of loading and unloading trucks. But yeah, and yes, thank you very much. But yeah, I think it's very much overlapping with the interests of people who are likely to read the Substack, and it is this one is fairly fun to me, and I thought, I was like, this is weird that I've been doing the philosophy Substack for like more than 2 years, and I haven't said anything about this book yet. This just seems like such an obvious thing.
I was going to say nothing about Ben Shapiro, and I was like, actually, though, I'm now maybe done one on Ben Shapiro. You feel like you should have, but
I don't know if I had actually. I might not have. I mean, if I have, I don't remember just off the top of my head. Just for fun, let me see. Shapiro. No, I don't think I have actually, because I just did a search of the archives for Shapiro, and I think there's all that's coming up is there's a brief mention of him in that thing I did about Sam Harris right at the beginning of the Substack. There's a brief mention of him in the Pacific APA talk I was just talking about. There was a brief mention of him in the thing about Jordan Peterson and atheism.
So I was thinking, I guess maybe Ben Shapiro is not trying as hard to appear intellectually sophisticated anymore.
Yeah, that could very well be. I mean, I think that he probably wrote The Right Side of History, which is the book that we'll be talking about, at the kind of high watermark of his interest in seeming intellectually sophisticated. That came out in 2018, and I remember at the time. Let me see if I can find this. I might not be able to anymore because that might have been an RAO. So let's see.
He put out 3 books in 2020, and then put another one out in July 2021, and then hasn't wrote one since.
Yeah, I saw that. So let me just see. Yeah. So So Matt McManus did a review of this book back in 2019, where I just want to read the opening because I always enjoyed this. Says, before getting into the meat of this review, I must admit to never paying much attention to Ben Shapiro until recently. He struck me as the latest in a long line of conservative pundits, going back to William F. Buckley, to launch careers as a polemicist by criticizing academia for its alleged and real left and liberal biases. Was he more articulate than some? Sure. But he's also prone to his share of hyperbole and philosophical vagaries. The subjects of his books, with cute titles like Bullies, How the Left's Culture of Fear and Intimidation Silences Americans, and How to Debate Leftists and Destroy Them, seemed much closer to Ann Coulter or pre-Trump Glenn Beck than to Russell Kirk. That reference to pre-Trump Glenn Beck is kind of a time capsule, because when Matt was writing this, Glenn Beck had gone in his this brief anti-Trump arc, and then he's come back, right? But of course, because most of them come back. But there are times in every polemicist's career where he must take a genuine stab at intellectual respectability, put away sloganeering and manic hyperbole, and see not through the dark lens of partisanship, but grasp the complex world as it truly is. Shapiro's The Right Side of History is a major effort in that direction, 200 plus pages analyzing the history of Western thought. And, then he goes on to say that it's not very good and not very convincing. Right? But yeah, I think that's, I think that this was his, in a lot of ways, The Right Side of History. I should say the full title is The Right Side of History, How Reason and Moral Purpose Made the West Great. It's his look at me. I don't just fight with college kids, for YouTube content. I also have serious ideas book.
Yeah, I mean, it's positing basically this long 2,500 years intellectual history and also positioning himself inside of it.
Yeah. I mean, so it's look at me. I grapple with big ideas. This is, I'm a serious person. And, I think what he has to say about those is, kind of ludicrous, but it definitely touches on what we're interested in here. So the basic narrative of the book is, that what made the West great, and we can talk about what the West means, because I don't think he's thought very much about that, but I think that the more you kind of poke at that, the less clear it gets. But what made the West so great was the combination of Judeo-Christian religion and religious values and Greek reason, which he uses more or less synonymously with the phrase Greek natural law thinking. So it's basically the Bible and Aristotle are what made the West.
Oh, so like the Bible and kind of like Christian Aristotelian.
Yeah, more or less, right? Like, so, something that's a little unkind that I do say at a certain point in here, to the thought I've had many times, is that this whole narrative would feel much less stilted if only Ben Shapiro had been born in some nice Episcopalian family. So, instead of being an Orthodox Jew, so
it's a thing of Judeo-Christianity, but does he reference any Jewish philosophers?
Not extensively. I mean, he has. I mean, if I'm remembering correctly, I have read this thing from cover to cover. The things I do for the people, but no.
I feel like Ben Shapiro would be like Spinoza, an atheist and an irrationalist.
No. He does get mad at Spinoza, right? Spinoza is one of the ones he brings up as a baddie. I'm trying to think about Jewish philosophers he might bring up as a goodie. I think if I'm remembering correctly, He, I think there is like a mention of Moses Maimonides, but it's like very cursory. Like it's just kind of, I mean, again, the overwhelming feeling that I had reading this thing, which I said the things I do for the people. I mean, in this case, it was the things I do for Michael Brooks. Is when we were working on his book. So he has a chapter on Ben Shapiro, so that's why I read it. But in any case, it has this very like junior high school book report feel to like the way a lot of it is arranged. Like every time he mentions the name of a philosopher, it's like the first mention of them will be like their full name, and then in parentheses there'll be birth and death dates. And so like the way he, like the way he mentions Maimonides, if I'm remembering this part correctly, it's just very like kind of checking the boxes. Oh yeah, better make sure to throw in a line about that somewhere. But yeah, I think there is like really there is really nothing actually about this book that couldn't have been written by a religious Christian, other than the fact that most of them probably would have left out the Judeo when they said Judeo-Christian. And, I mean, I guess there would have been more specifically Christian stuff in there, I would expect. But like, this substance of what he does say is indistinguishable from what a Christian writer would say. And it's very, sorry, I'm just trying to look this up, but yeah, it's like, so the story he tells is pretty much just, okay, so you have these two fonts of all the wisdom of the West, the Judeo-Christian religious contribution, and, the good Greek stuff, which is more or less the bits of Aristotle that, the church got excited about.
I mean, to also honestly, like all of the early Christian stuff, which is actually intellectually sophisticated, and that's probably not in the Bible, is also just Greek stuff, right?
Yeah, right. And I should say, like, the other thing that's maybe worth pausing on about this phrase Judeo-Christian is, like, again, it feels kind of ridiculous because it just seems like for almost everything he wants to talk about, again, the version, Gentile Ben Shapiro could have just said Christian and it would have changed nothing. But like also, because he does have to say Judeo-Christian, of course, given his own, religious affiliation, that means that it feels very conceptually awkward to me because, it's a really simple-minded point, but, Judaism is one religion, Christianity is another. These aren't the same thing. What they have in common is that they're Abrahamic monotheisms. In other words, they're religions that take the Old Testament to be divinely inspired or revealed, and believes that the God of the Hebrew Scriptures is in some sense the only God, putting aside all complications about the incarnation and the Trinity and all of that. And it's like, okay, if there's stuff beyond that like they have in common, I'm not like, that seems like the common core. But of course, obvious problem, if that is what you mean, then Islam would also be a Judeo-Christian religion, right? That's views the Hebrew Scriptures as, sacred text, thinks that the God of those Scriptures is the only one, actually in a much more uncomplicated way, and one that's much more similar to Judaism than a lot of Christian doctrine is. And
on the other side, very serious about Aristotle, at least in the early days.
Exactly. Right. I mean, it's like, look, if you, and then as far as the other, so it seems like that would count as Judeo-Christian religion. And if it does, well, if the other thing that made the West great is the influence from Greek philosophy, and, they recovered it over there before it made it back to, Western Europe. So, very big influence on this, Islamic intellectual tradition. So wait a second, does the West include Islam It doesn't seem to in Ben Shapiro's worldview. In fact, it's pretty explicit in the book that it doesn't. Because he, he doesn't mention it explicitly, but there's like a passage I quote where he seems to be very explicitly contrasting Islamic civilization with Western civilization as two different things. And
the Muslims lost the Battle of Tours,
yeah.
which is an amazing one. Which is, I guess, if you're a civilization and you win basically every battle for 120 years, and you get all the Middle East and North Africa and Spain, but then you lose one battle in France, it's so over for you.
Yeah, it's a really weird passage. I mean, this is actually maybe worth just looking at for a second because it's such an odd one, right? He says, here we go. While many historians tout the power of Islamic civilization during this time period, he's talking about the Middle Ages, and Islamic civilization did thrive on the Arabian Peninsula, particularly when Islamic civilization came up against Western civilization at the Battle of Tours. Islamic forces were soundly defeated, which is really weird. Like, he doesn't quite draw out what the lesson is there, right? Like, it's
like the Western civilization is now like Franco-German barbarians, as opposed to the Greeks who got whacked so hard by the Muslims they eventually were entirely conquered.
Yeah,
for the first time in their history, apart from the Romans.
Right. I mean, which is always the funny thing about this construct, the West, right? Is trying to figure out who's included, who's not included, because oftentimes, of course, as the phrase itself taken literally would suggest, we're talking about an actual geographical region. But if so, it's like, well, all right. I mean, Israel certainly wouldn't count as part of the geographical region. That's clearly,
Cyprus is in Europe and not Asia for entirely arbitrary reasons. Well, not arbitrary, but not geographical reasons.
Yeah,
not physical geographical reasons.
Like, yeah, it's not. So it's like, yeah, so Israel wouldn't count at all, which means that in terms of Shapiro's whole framework here, right, that he, going from Leo Strauss to whoever Leo Strauss was getting it from to Tertullian, right? Shapiro loves this phrase Athens and Jerusalem as the as the twin sources of Western civilization. So it's like, okay, well, if we're talking about geographic region, one of those doesn't count as part of the region, right? Like it's fairly clearly, right? Nobody like would draw a map in a way that would include it that way. And if you're talking about, like some sort of cultural category that goes back long, but that it's like a cultural category that's supposed to like go through thousands of years, then, I don't know. I think you tell Aristotle that he has more in common with like Gallic tribesmen than he does with Egyptians, because he and the Gallic tribesmen are both part of something called the West. He'd find that very confusing, right? Yeah. So
or Persians.
Yeah, right. yeah, exactly, right. So none of this is at all obvious, and it seems like, again, the thing that Shapiro probably most wants to exclude from the category, right, when the like would actually be Islam, which seems like it has the same fonts that he's interested in. Although it is also interesting thinking about, like, if you cast a wider net than just thinking about the West and Islam, it is interesting to try to figure out how all this is supposed to relate to the rest of the planet, because he says a lot of okay, so he says things like, here we go, those twin notions, those diamonds of spiritual genius built our civilization and built us as individuals. If you believe that life is more than materialistic pleasures and pain avoidance, you're a product of Athens and Jerusalem, if you believe the government has no right to intrude upon the exercise of your individual will, and that you're bound by a moral duty to pursue virtue, you're a product of Jerusalem and Athens. If you believe that human beings are capable of bettering our world through the use of our reason and are bound by a higher purpose to do so, you are a product of Jerusalem and Athens, and then blah, 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 right? But it's like, all right, putting aside the endorsement, I think, of what would take, the thing about the government not being able to intrude on your individual will, which, he doesn't actually believe either.
It's completely a thing of where people like laws that I like don't violate anyone's freedom.
Yeah, taken seriously, that sentence just sounds like, anarchism. He's clearly not.
Yeah, there's no way to have law.
Yeah, it's, in fact, sort of super anarchism, because even a lot of anarchists think that it's like there's some sense in which we can have law, and we'll have a weird, we'll have some weird enforcement system that doesn't count as a state and whatever. But a really extreme form of anarchism, and obviously Ben Shapiro doesn't believe that at all, right? But putting that aside, what really interests me here is the first part where he says that if you believe that life is more than materialistic pleasures and pain avoidance, you're a product of Jerusalem and Athens. And this is really, it's like, okay, well, hold on. Seriously, what about the rest of the planet? This is let's do our most generous drawing of the map of the West. And in fact, let's do it way more generous than Shapiro himself clearly wants to, and just throw in everybody in the world who is historically influenced, more than a couple hundred years ago, by the Bible and the parts of Greek philosophy that Ben Shapiro likes. So we're including the whole Muslim world, whatever. That still leaves a lot of the world. Is the idea that everybody, for example, in China before the arrival of Christian missionaries, thought that that life was no more than materialistic pleasure and pain avoidance?
Yeah, and where do we have to look to actually find kind of the intellectual defense of hedonism?
Right.
Especially 18th and 19th century England.
Yeah, right. No, that's right. That's where you actually get an explicit defense of that idea. Is
it's nowhere. I think the only times I can think of it in ancient philosophy were in Greek philosophy. I don't see anywhere in Chinese or Indian philosophy.
Yeah, right. It's not like Confucius thought that. It's not like the Buddha thought
it's
that.
It's insanely not Confucius thought.
Yeah, right. It's very, 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 very far from what any of the any of the non-Western religious traditions think, right? And so it's just such an obvious objection that it's kind of amazing that he never seems to pause to think about it, right? That it's these clearly aren't the only things that can give you that, that can give you the things that you want to get out of it. Certainly not that one. My God, right? That it's oh, everybody in the world is just is just a hedonist, except people who've been taught not to, by the Bible and Aristotle. Really just is not a thought you could have if you were at all at any point in this process thinking about, again, the existence of Confucianism, Buddhism, et cetera, anything that we still know about from indigenous religions in the Western Hemisphere, et cetera, any of that, right? It's this is just not something that's been out there. Again, you do have a form of this thought with Bentham, in at the end of the 18th century in a very long Christian country, right? But even Bentham,
it's this constant contradiction, right? Where the Americans' right kind of trad traditionalism is a defense of like neoliberalism from like 40 years ago. And so like it's completely contrary to any like actual thing before capitalism, and so is innately kind of defending like the hedonism, like these ideas that he denounces, that he thinks is the fundamental thing that kind of is opposed to, only come about when his kind of like the economic system that he fundamentally defends comes about.
Yeah, right, exactly. I mean, this is the core contradiction in most conservatism, that, like, traddy kind of conservatism. I mean, the smarter ones do get the contradiction, at least to a point, right? Your Patrick Deneen types and whatnot, like sort of see, okay, well, hold on. It actually does seem like untrammeled free market capitalism uh, does seem to be connected to a lot of things that we really don't like. But I think that's generally something you get with conservative intellectuals who are going to be much less mainstream than Ben Shapiro. And two, even the people who do have that thought, like, I think they non-coincidentally tend to be extremely vague about what to do about it, right? Because like you could, because if you actually said, oh, maybe to have the kind of world we want, we need a different kind of economic system, then either you've become some sort of strange conservative socialist, which is not a step that any of them are willing to make, or I mean, things get really exciting because now we get to hear the plan to like reinstate feudalism, which is also not a step that
or the United States maybe instate feudalism for the first time ever.
Yeah, exactly. In the U.S. case, that would be it would be like since we didn't have it in the first place, right? This would be
We're defending the Constitution by electing a king.
Our early experiment with it. Yeah, right. So yeah, I think this is all. I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think the sort of thing that Ben Shapiro wants to see for like culture war reasons as the essence of like enemy thought is this kind of extreme nihilistic secularism that didn't exist and really couldn't have existed in a pre-capitalist world, right? Like it's and which again is actually I really like that point, because I mean it connects to one of the places that I ultimately want to go with all this, which is like, okay, so the essay is called my essay, and this is called Ben Shapiro as a Historian of Philosophy, and that's what we call the stream on GTAA. The one you picked for TIR is Ben Shapiro's Philosophy of History, which actually does end up at the very end being what the essay is about, right? Because I think he's, one of the claims I ultimately want to make is that he's so committed to this kind of extreme idealism about history that the reason that bad things happen, the only reason really that bad things could happen, is because the wrong ideas are in people's heads. That he really can't imagine that anybody disagrees, right? Like he actually ends up just attributing a version of that to like everybody, Marx, everybody. But yeah, I should say on the way to that point that, quite a bit of the book is him going through different historical thinkers and, basically classifying them as being good or bad according to whether they've
I mean, it's the best way to do history of philosophy. That means our tier list video was peak.
Yeah, exactly. That was the peak content that we'll ever do here. Exactly, right. That's the way you should do it.
History of anything is the same: good, bad, good, good, bad, good.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Absolutely. And it's very, so the way he does his, I mean, his was less rigorous than ours. We did a, we did like a, whole thing was quantitative, tiers, but yeah, his sorting of the philosophers into good and bad is according to how they feel about these two spiritual gems, from which all the greatness of the West flows, and so to the extent basically people are good to the extent that they affirm these things, and they're bad, to one extent or another, depending, to the extent that they departed from. So, I talk about four examples, less Hegel than the other three, right? But the four examples I talk about are Shapiro's treatment of Hume, Kant, Hegel, and Marx. And Hume is a good one to start out with because Hume, in a certain sense, is the has got to be the devil for Ben Shapiro, right? I mean, as far as like the rankings of philosophers, he has to be one of the worst villains in the story because he's because he's expressing skepticism about all of the things that Shapiro likes, about Judeo-Christian religion and also about natural law thinking. I mean, Hume's the one who's coming along and said, no, you actually can't derive an ought from an is. And what I found really striking in the Hume case is that, like, Shapiro makes so little pretense to engaging with the arguments at all. I mean, he just kind of notes them in a shocked way and like tut-tuts at how bad it is. But he doesn't actually tell you why Hume is wrong. Like,
can you believe that someone in the 18th century was saying miracles aren't real? That's so shocking to a 21st century man.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, so that one's a perfect example, because if you look at what he says about, Hume and miracles, he says, here's the quote: Hume discounted the possibility of miracles. He said that the laws of nature speak to us more frequently than any human testimony, and therefore the evidence for miracles was annihilated. And if you already know what Hume said, you can recognize in that sentence a perfectly fine summary of it. If sure, right, that's you can recognize what Hume is saying in that description. If you don't know what Hume said, that description would give you no clue, right? I mean, I don't think anybody encountering Hume's argument for the first time in that sentence would have any idea how the argument was supposed to go, or what the idea was. And again, Shapiro is certainly not lingering on it to tell you why Hume is wrong about this, right? And similarly, he goes on, he even argued that polytheism is as rational as monotheism, and he just moves on to the next thought. So, well,
can you believe?
Well, why did he say
that in 1789?
Yeah. Yeah. Why did he think that? Right? Better yet, once you told us why he thought that, then Mr. Shapiro, what's could you give us the counter argument? Could you tell us why he was wrong? Right? As opposed to just kind of noting, oh, here are some bad opinions that the bad man held, which is really all that's going on in this passage, right? I mean, so, I mean, just to kind of do slightly better than Ben Shapiro does there, Hume's point about miracles is that, it's not an argument against the possibility of miracles. It's an argument against belief in miracles on the basis of testimony. That, the idea is that if you're our evidence that the laws of nature were, universally hold in certain ways is really, really strong, right? That these are really well confirmed beliefs. And, of course, if you wanted to push back on this, you could say, well, we have lots of evidence that these laws usually apply or something like that. But that's not the same as saying that, we have lots of evidence that they always apply. But I think that's a little bit of an evasion, because I think that what all of us normally take this mountain of evidence to be a mountain of evidence for is not just that, the law, like, take like the law of gravity, right? That's what's being violated if you say that, you saw somebody walking on water. It's not just that this mountain of evidence gives us a reason to think that the law of gravity usually holds, or that it's held in all these cases that we've observed or whatever. I think what all of us intuitively normally take this to be a mountain of evidence for is the claim that it's going to hold in every situation, right? I mean, that's why you don't try to walk on water yourself. That you even if you're in a new path, like, it's a river you've never visited before, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Like you take it for granted that all the usual laws of
we wouldn't fund a science project to like try to walk across the river 1 billion times.
Yeah, right. I mean, like you would take it for granted that the right conclusion from all this evidence was that in this particular instance, if you try to walk on water, your foot will sink. And like whatever probability assignment you want to give that, it's so crushingly high that you would never normally pause to think about it, right? Like it just, it's just a given, right? And so Hume's point is that the evidence of testimony, even testimony given by otherwise reliable sources, just isn't sufficient to overwhelm that, right? That it's always more likely that the otherwise reliable seeming person, right, if that's your only evidence, right, it's always going to be I mean, it's not certain, there's probabilities, right, but it's always going to be a more reasonable supposition that the otherwise reliable person is lying to you, or playing an elaborate practical joke, or has experienced a psychotic break from reality, and or is running a elaborate social experiment to see how you'll react, or etc., right? And this is all stuff that I think we take for granted, in the normal course of things. I mean, the sort of silly example I gave in there, which is a version of like what I've given to students when we're going over this in Hume, is if I told you that on the last week before he died, Pope Francis was flown in great secrecy to Los Angeles, so he could have dinner with me, President Trump, and Vladimir Putin at my apartment, and that they really worked very hard to hush it up so it didn't leak to the media.
And
it wouldn't matter how
subscribe to the Patreon, you'll hear that dinner next month.
There you go. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that'll be amazing. So yeah, like if you like, no matter how reliable you thought I was before I said that, right? You wouldn't think it was more likely that I was telling the truth about this than that an otherwise very reliable person was pulling your leg, experienced a break from reality, lying, joking, whatever the situation, like add up all the other possibilities, right? And those are just much more likely than that I was telling the truth about it again. Like it's that an otherwise extremely stoutly reliable person was saying something false, however unlikely, isn't as unlikely as that scenario that I just described being true. Now, I mean, of course, that doesn't mean that nothing could ever convince you that that was true. It's just that, take my word for it, isn't going to get it done, right? Like just the testimony is not going to is not going to be at all sufficient, right? Um, so and the striking thing about that is that, look, that scenario that I just gave about the Pope and Vladimir Putin and the president, that didn't even violate any laws of physics, right? Like that's actually entirely nomologically possible, right? It's just it's just fantastically unlikely. And even that not physically impossible thing is sufficiently so fantastically unlikely that even if your entire experience with me previously was that I was the most trustworthy person you'd ever met in your life, you still would be rightly skeptical when I said that, right? I mean, that's you demand more evidence before you believe that, right? That's Hume's point about miracles. And I'm not saying this conversation ended. There are no objections that somebody who did believe in the rationality of belief in miracles could make at this point. But I do think it's telling that Shapiro doesn't bother with that. There's no, I mean, especially because, again, as we were saying earlier, this is supposed to be his whole thing, right? He's supposed to be the destroyer of weak arguments, right? Why isn't he doing his thing?
But it's also a thing of, well, what is Ben Shapiro's interest in defending miracles? Because obviously, I mean, there are miracles in the Talmud, but the normal thing of defending miracles is to defend like the miracles of Jesus, which presumably Ben is at least.
Yeah, Ben is presumably skeptical about those, right? I mean,
yeah.
Like, in fact, yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure. In fact, as a as a devout religious Jew, I mean, I would assume that the party line on that is none of that happened, and
as far as I'm aware, like
if that wasn't the party line, the only other option would be that this was like the miracles performed by the Egyptian priests in the Book of Exodus, right? That this is like
the bad ones.
Yeah, that like this is these are like devil miracles. So yeah, I mean, that's right. Yeah, no, and again, I think that I don't know how invested he is in miracles in particular, other than that, sure, there are miracles reported in the Talmud, there are miracles that are reported in Hebrew scriptures, but like I I don't I don't think it's necessarily like a vital issue to him. I think it's just like he's just given I think he just doesn't like the religious skepticism, right? And
I mean, because there's a certain tradition where Hume's objection might make a lot less sense, which is the kind of American evangelical tradition, where miracles are almost become non-miraculous because they believe that God is basically intervening like non-stop in like very trivial issues. Like the tradition of like nothing in the Bible, but the whole idea like everyone has a guardian angel and all this kind of stuff. There's an idea of constant micro intervention from like on high, where laws of nature and so on are just violated all the time. In which case, then yeah, sure, why not? But my impression of Jewish religious tradition is that it's very much the other way around, where
for sure,
very minimal like heavenly intervention for a very long time.
Yeah, I think that's basically right. I think if you get into some of the Kabbalistic tradition and like Hasidism and all that, like it does get a little bit more God's intervening a lot, but
yeah, I mean, I have seen some stuff of like God is bringing us victory in Gaza or whatever.
Yeah, right. And that was a very common there are definitely people like
it's not doing very well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there are people who do say things like that for sure, but like also one, I don't I think that the sort of strand Orthodox Judaism that I'm guessing Ben Shapiro, comes from. I mean, I don't know anything super detailed about his background, but like I'm guessing is very much not like that, right? And like it's probably pretty like mainstream kind of modern orthodoxy. And two, uh, certainly the dominant, like I mean, like the like Hasidic stuff is like that's like 18th century religious revivalism, right? I mean, like actually in a certain way, the Eastern European Jewish equivalent to like some of the Protestant stuff that you're talking about.
Yeah.
But like the sort of formative move in mainstream rabbinical Judaism, a couple thousand years ago was very much to like get away from all that. I mean, like that there's to just be like, look, don't go listening to people who say that they saw a sign from God or whatever, right? Like just just listen to the scholars and what they say about like there's a
Right. I mean, that's pretty fundamental to rejecting Jesus, right?
yeah, sure. I mean, like and like also just just in general. I mean, like that there's a very like I don't know. I think there's even like a story in the Talmud where rabbis are arguing about something and there are all these sort of like miraculous signs that like the one side is right and then but like the rest of the story is like who gives a shit, like this is the like you have to
the better arguments.
yeah, exactly. Right. Like, it's just I don't care what's going on with the sky or whatever. Look right here where it says in the Torah, and like, yeah,
Do you
exactly.
know
Right?
which religious group believes in constant intervention from on high?
I mean, more than the evangelicals.
Yeah, Sunni Islam.
Oh, interesting. Okay, yeah.
There's a certain strand in Islam which believes that like every single moment is directly ordained and ordered by God. There aren't really natural laws at all.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's certainly yeah, I mean, like there's certainly kind of like Protestantism that selectively gets close to that. I mean, I think about so there's a fun novel by Robert Harris called Act of Oblivion about after the restoration of the monarchy at the end of the English Civil War, Parliament passes this act that basically says almost nothing that happened in like the last 20 years can be held against anybody, right? That like everything's, it's the act of oblivion, right? Like it's all, we're pretty much wiping the slate clean, right? Nobody's gonna be punished for anything except for the people who signed the order to kill Charles. They're still on the hook. And so the book is about like the last couple of regicides, like escaping to North America and being pursued there, and etc. And there's this whole little strand where like one of them is like writing a memoir, and he's and it's sort of occurring to him that's like, oh, wait a second, throughout the whole Civil War, like every single like victorious battle was received like like every time we won a battle is like, oh look, God has clearly favored us, right? Like so he's clearly on our side, and sort of starting to occur to him like 10, 20 years later, it's like, wait a second, if that's true, what does that mean about everything that's happened since then? Like, and it's tricky, right? Like because eventually you're going to lose, right? I mean, nobody wins forever. So if everything is God intervening to put his thumb on the scale, that gets difficult. But yeah,
right.
In any case,
if God is kind of ordaining victory and so on, that he's half a Muslim and half a Christian,
yeah, exactly. And up until very recently, one thing definitely not was Jewish. So
yeah. I was going to say very recently he's gone to Judaism, but
yeah, right. So yeah, the thing about miracles again, I mean, it's a small example, but I think it's it's just telling to me as far as like how little effort that Shapiro puts into engaging with the content of any of this stuff, at least in the Hume case. The second one I look at is Kant, and I think at least with Kant, give him credit for this much. He actually does engage with the arguments a bit more than he does with Hume. I mean, Hume, he really doesn't at all. He just sort of says like,
with Kant, he engages and fucks it up.
What's that?
With Kant, he engages with the arguments and fucks them up.
Yeah, right. I mean, well, so with Kant, like with Hume, he's just like, oh, look at the bad guy who thinks bad things. Shake your head, right? With Kant, he kind of likes Kant. It's a mixed report, but yeah, he does engage with the arguments, and he engages with the arguments.
Surely Kant is meant to be a good guy, but then there is a real atheistic trend in kind of Ben Shapiro thought, which is the strand from Ayn Rand, right? And for her, Kant is evil.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that Ben Shapiro has much of an Ayn Rand strand exactly. I mean, they overlap on markets, but I think, but Shapiro likes Kant insofar as there's this very strict morality there that like basically all the ways that Kant seems very uptight he likes, but like ultimately he doesn't like the fact that Kant is departing from natural law morality, that Kant is attempting to ground ethics in something that has nothing to do with the workings of nature, the sort of natural purposes of things, or anything about God or any of that, right? Like that's really Shapiro's objection. And basically, when it comes to his treatment of Kant, he says, all right. So there are two things, and I guess we'll save the one for even though it comes earlier in the quote for later, just because it's amazing to me. But the other is that Shapiro makes basically all of the mistakes that somebody would make if they were like first starting to try to understand Kant's ethics, and they just
they handed in their first term ethics essay and got a D.
Yeah, exactly, right. I mean, it's like this is like all the kinds of misunderstandings that like any competent intro to ethics instructor would like spend some time in class trying to make sure that people were avoiding. He manages to make, right. So he says, right. So it says moral logic relied on categorical imperatives. Already a little bit of a problem with the plural there, categorical imperatives. That moral logic relied on categorical imperatives, absolute truths. Those categorical imperatives included injunctions never to use other human beings as means, problem, but rather to treat them as ends. Actions are good in themselves, not because they have good effects. That part's right. Act to pursue good makes us free. And then he says, to our secular minds, this is beautiful stuff and the closest philosophy has ever crafted to a serious sense of meaning and purpose. But Kant's idealism could not sustain itself. His philosophy of morality soon fell apart. Kant's categorical imperative, the idea that every law must be generalizable, provides a nice guidepost for human activity, and one that seems to mirror the golden rule problem. But Kant's categorical imperative does not answer more complex moral calculations. Is it really correct that we do a wrong whenever we lie? Even to hide a Jew when the Nazi is at the door, as, for example, Kant seems to suggest. Furthermore, Kant's categorical imperative isn't objectively mandatory. Why not simply assume that everyone else should abide by Kant's rule and break all the rules yourself? And this is really like I've intentionally skipped the worst part. We can go back to it, but like this really is just a mess of everything that you might sort of casually get wrong about Kant. That again, I mean, I would just think that a good intro to ethics professor would like go out of her way to make sure that people weren't making these exact mistakes. So, like at the end, he seems to think that Kant thinks that, when Kant says that it's like morality is objectively mandatory, what he means is that it's like objectively in your prudential interests, right? It's going to be good for you in that sense, which really couldn't be further from what Kant thinks, right? I mean, like the whole thing, categorical imperative is as opposed to a hypothetical one, right? At least implicit if, right? So, a hypothetical imperative only applies to you if you happen to share the relevant goal. The thing that makes categorical imperative categorical is that it doesn't, right? It's binding on everybody all the time, regardless of their goals. And like the correct thing that Shapiro says about, for Kant, this makes us free. It's like, well, Kant thinks that we're acting autonomously when we're acting on the basis of reason, as opposed to acting heteronomously, which means that we're acting on the basis of like desires, which is not, bad. It's not that Kant thinks that it's morally wrong to act on the basis of desires if it doesn't, conflict with morality. But, that's not the stuff that's like where, morality and freedom and all that really lives for Kant, right? That you only get when you're acting autonomously. You're acting on the basis of a law you give yourself with your own reason. And so, so again, this idea that it's like a great objection to Kant to say that like acting morally might not be in your self-interest, like as far as like achieving the most of your, heteronomous desires as possible, I think really misses the point by a mile. I mean, like Kant actually, Kant makes a big point of saying that we can really tell that somebody's acting on the basis of the moral law when it goes against their interests in that sense, right? That Kant, like, and I mean, like, I don't want to. I mean, I'm obviously, again, I think what Kant actually thinks is much more interesting than Shapiro's depiction of it, and it's worth taking seriously, etc. But I also don't want to miss the fact that like Kant is a massive weirdo about a lot of this stuff. And so, like Kant says, for example, that most of us preserve our life, like have all these heteronomous reasons to preserve our lives. We enjoy being alive. You can really tell that somebody is acting on the basis of the moral law when they virtuously don't commit suicide, even though their life is horrible, right? Like that's that's like a example of something that Kant says in the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. Kant also makes a very big deal of saying that there's a categorical imperative, that the formulations that he gives of it are just supposed to be different.
Which is a weird idea, but it is what he thinks.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think it's perfectly respectable to say that Kant is wrong about this, right? But my problem with Shapiro's presentation of it is that he doesn't seem to know, or certainly doesn't convey that it's what he thinks, right? So Kant doesn't think like, the act only according to that maxim that you could will to be a universal law, and, always treat humanity, whether in your own person or that of another, is, merely, as an end in itself and not merely as a means to an end. Like Kant doesn't think these are different categorical imperatives. He thinks there's the categorical imperative. There's this singular moral standard that you could express in these different ways, right? Which again, I think it's totally to say, once you really look at it, Kant is just, not plausible on that, right? But it is what he thinks. And then both of those formulations, the categorical imperative, Shapiro gets really importantly wrong, and in ways that like really shows is not getting the idea that when so if you say that the thing about moral rules should be generalizable, right? I guess is how Shapiro put it. He's connecting that to the golden rule, and although also that thing about how everybody else could just you could just be a free rider makes it sound like it's not even the golden rule, like it's just sort of prudential social contract thing, right? But of course it's neither of those. It's not the golden rule. It's not it's not a prudential social contract thing. Kant sees this as a kind of test of consistency, right? It's not only act on that maxim that you would want to be universal law, that you would, it's not about role reversal or empathy or any of that stuff, right? It's only act on that maxim that you could will to be universal law, that you could coherently will that without undermining your reason for action in the first place. Like, if the classic example is if I lend or if I ask you to lend me some money, and I say, oh, I'll totally be able to pay you back tomorrow, knowing full well that I won't, but I really need the money. That I could not will that to be a universal law consistently with my motive for acting in the first place, right? Because I'm telling you the lie in order so you'll give me the money, but if everybody lied in this situation, then nobody would believe it and nobody would get the money. That's not a role reversal thing. It's not oh, wouldn't that be a shame that line wouldn't work, right? Like it's again, Kant sees this as test of consistency, and in some ways the thing about using people's means is even worse, because Kant doesn't like, Kant has a lot of weird views, but like Kant is not a crazy person who thinks that, like, if you're holding some boxes, if your arms are full of boxes and, your friend is standing by the door and you say, hey man, could you do me a favor and hold open the door for a second, that you've just violated the moral law because you're using them as a means to open the door for you, right? Like that would be, and Kant certainly doesn't hold it. I mean, nobody holds that. Kant says it's wrong to.
When he talks about Kant in terms of the golden rule, is that in terms of him advocating, arguing for the golden rule?
That sounds like what Shapiro is saying. Yeah.
Again, that's not Judaism.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it sort of is. I mean, there's I mean, yes, the golden, I mean, it is funny that Shapiro references the golden rule there, because again, I think what it's revealing of is that, because there is something very, very similar in the Talmud, but it is funny that Shapiro actually uses the phrase the golden rule, right? Because that's obviously a reference to Jesus. And so, again, he's in his sort of culture war context, right? I mean, obvious, like he's going to talk about that, even though again that's not even his thing, right? I mean, that's the like there is, I mean, yeah, there is this thing in the Talmud where somebody comes to Rabbi Hillel, right, the guy all the student centers are named after, and says, "Could you, I'll convert if you tell me the whole of the law while standing on one foot." And which of course sounds impossible, because there are like 613 commandments in the Torah, but he jumps up on one foot, right, and says, "Don't do unto others what is hateful unto you. All the rest is commentary. Go and learn." Mm-hmm. So it's so there is that like pretty close equivalent there, but again, it's and you find similar things in lots of religious traditions. I mean, it's a pretty common, I think it's a pretty commonly held moral intuition by humans. So it shows up, in major tradition in one way or another.
I live like 100 meters away from a yeshiva, which used to be in a city called Sunderland, which is about 12 miles away from where I live. And it was called Sunderland Yeshiva, and then they moved it to where I live in Gateshead. And do you know what they call it now? Sunderland Yeshiva.
Sure.
They just didn't rename it. It's not Sunderland anymore, but
yeah. Fair. That's so yeah, it's so the Kant thing is a mess. I can't finish up this part without just saying this because it's just too good not to. The thing I skipped earlier is just like, I don't know, man. I mean, maybe I'm just being a little bit of an obnoxious intellectual snob at this point, but like, come on. There's when he first starts talking about Kant, he says, this is my favorite line in this whole book. Kant thus embarked on an almost Platonic quest for knowledge beyond the material, but where Plato looked to the realm of forms, Kant looked instead to the human heart.
I'm not sure Kant had a heart.
No, I mean, like, Kant is like the moral philosopher who's most hostile to sort of emotion and sentiment.
Right, Jesus said, "Love your neighbor," and then Kant's thing was like, "It doesn't matter what you feel about your neighbor; you have to do right by him."
Yeah, exactly. Like he does this sort of awkward attempt to reinterpret Jesus saying, "Love your neighbor," as being like, actually, Jesus, of course, wouldn't tell you to, you have to love your neighbor because, you can't.
Kant thinks you can't will emotions.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So, and and Kant also thinks that ought implies can, right? That it can only be the case that you should do something if you're capable of doing it, which is very unclear to me that Jesus thinks, but whatever. Yeah, it's yeah, no. So it's again, like this couldn't, like, of every moral philosopher, like every historically important moral philosopher, there like, if you know a little bit about what he thinks, there isn't, you couldn't find one that it would be funnier to say this about than Kant, right? That he that his search took him to the human heart. And then I wrap up by talking about Hegel and Marx, and obviously both of these are baddies in Shapiro's categorization scheme. And what I find, I mean, I kind of give him a hard time about, like, the fact that Shapiro brings up Hegel's love for state bureaucrats, which is true, right? Like, that he brings this up as a sort of part of his, like, demonology of, like, oh, this is like the font of all the, like, bad progressive stuff, right? I mean, that's, I mean, he doesn't quite connect the dots, but I mean, I think reading between the lines a little bit, that's where he's going with it. But, like, he doesn't bring up Marx's views on state bureaucrats, which are very different, right? Like, when he's talking about Marx. And in fact, Marx is all about, like, sort of having these hyper democratic forms of governance that, would really, like, severely limit, the influence of state bureaucrats on purpose, right? And in fact, Marx is very critical of Hegel on exactly this point, right? And it is comments on, on Hegel's, constitutional scheme. So, like, that's a sort of maybe pettier thing, but, like, the bigger thing that really, I think is, like, the bigger takeaway in this whole section is that it says there's, sorry, let me just see if I can find this again. So he says, okay, the French Revolution didn't end in a communist utopia, but according to Karl Marx, it was the first step in the gradual evolution of markets toward communism. In the 18th premiere of Louis Napoleon, a pamphlet written in 1852, blah, blah, blah. Marx wrote that the French Revolution had set for itself, quote, the task of unchaining and setting up modern bourgeois society, unquote. but that its own commitment to classical Republican ideals had prevented the class uprising that could liberate its citizens from the shackles of class. Later, here we go. This is where it gets clearest. He says, like Hegel, Marx attempted to uncover the plot of history, which he thought inevitably led to a brighter future. But unlike Hegel, Marx believed that human beings had an active part in their history making in order to change themselves. Human beings, Marx posited, were animals and thus part of the environment, but they could also change the environment in which they lived, and by doing so, change themselves. Here's the key line: all that would be required was the will to overthrow old systems. So, look, it's, if you're somebody who's watched a bunch of these streams before, you'll know where this is going. But like, this is like, I think there's really, like, it's not just that like Ben Shapiro doesn't know very much about Marx, which is sure, right? But it's like, I think this is a really funny instance of the general thing where, again, as the title you put on the stream on TIR, right? Ben Shapiro's philosophy of history, right? Ben Shapiro so deeply assumes that all good or bad things come from good or bad ideas and nothing else, right? That he just cannot wrap his head around the idea that anyone anywhere, even Karl Marx, disagrees. That like it just, well, they must disagree about which ideas are good or bad, right? Like that. That's it. Like that's the only sort of disagreement on this point he can imagine. So it's like in those quotes that I just read, it's like Marx thinks the only reason that there wasn't a transition to socialism in 18th century France is because people didn't have enough, the right ideas, the right will.
Right. I mean, Marx believes in willpower, and Kant believes in the power of love.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's the best note to end this on.
What did you write today, actually, to begin with?
Oh yeah. So the thing that came out today is about history and freedom in Marx and G.A. Cohen. And so it's about the basically it's a version of, I mean, there's like a much longer version that's going to be at a collection that I'm co-editing with Matt McManus, but this is a very short version of my take on Cohen's defense of historical materialism in his book Karl Marx's Theory of History, and which connected to the point just now about Ben Shapiro, is about the idea that that political and legal institutions are downstream of relations of production, which are downstream from the level of development of the mode of production, not in fact willpower, so it's, and I'm kind of connecting that to Cohen's sort of normative case for socialism and thinking about the relationship between the two, and thinking about what's, using it as a kind of way of thinking about what maybe is missing from Cohen's normative case for socialism, because like one way to think about this is if you think about the sort of values in the name of which the French Revolution was fought, right? Liberty, equality, fraternity. If you look at like Cohen's book, Why Not Socialism, you basically get like socialist theories of equality and fraternity, but you really don't get much about liberty at all, right? And I think that you're missing something there, because I think for Marx that's actually the one that matters the most, and it's and I think that there's a like I think that what Cohen is saying is like really strengthened by bringing it back in, right? Because I think that the, like, okay, exploitation might be objectionable because it leads to lots of inequality, or because it leads to, lots of people being treated in a way that, that indicates that we don't care about them very much. And fair enough. I think it is actually deeply objectionable for both of those reasons, right? But like, I think if you're not really talking about freedom per se front and center, you're missing a lot of what's sort of directly normatively relevant about exploitation. And I also think that you're sort of missing something about the way that, Marx's picture of history could connect to a view about the desirability of socialism, right? That it's like that that like what's expanding through the bourgeois revolution, and then eventually, inshallah, the socialist one is human freedom, right? So anyway, that's that's what that essay is about.
Cool. And what are you planning on writing this week, if you know?
Yeah, I think so. So I think that it's going to be back to class abstractionism, because there have been some further developments in the in that those exchanges, and but I want to do it. I mean, we'll see if this comes together this week, but it's like, if I do that this week, I mean, I want to do it in a way that kind of tries to like strike a balance between sort of getting into, like all the sort of nitty gritty of like why the argument doesn't make sense, which like I think there's a danger that could just sort of, be diminishing returns at this point, right? Like once you kind of do like, okay, here's some like really specific objections, and here's some of the stuff that one of the guys said to argue that the objections didn't work, and here's what's wrong with that. And it's like, at a certain point, it might be trying to the patience of people who are only sort of casually invested in any of this, right? So I want to kind of strike a balance between that and like also like kind of keeping the perspective on why anybody should actually care about any of this, right? It's like, is this just sort of academic-y Marxists fighting over like very, very abstract things that that like ultimately don't really matter, or like is this a sort of strange academic-y Marxist expression of like a disagreement that like actually normal people who are interested in socialism and all that do have some reason to care about?
Oh, I think it's a cool way to frame it.
Fair enough.
Cool. Bye.
Bye.